Huzzah, my wonderful students! Another day of learning! Today, we will be discussing the amendments to the Constitution. There are currently 27 of them. Now, the Constitution's amendments are divided into major categories. The first set is the Bill of Rights, then the Civil War amendments, and finally the other amendments, because they're kind of a mishmash. Now, the Bill of Rights is obviously the first 10, but the 11th and the 12th are grouped into that category because they happened also at the very same time, or, within a few years of each other. The Civil War amendments, self-explanatory, they're the amendments that were ratified at the end of the Civil War. The later amendments go all the way up through until 1992 when the last amendment was ratified. Now, the First Amendment protects the rights of Americans to worship as they please or to even have no religion at all. It also protects freedom of speech and the press. This freedom does have limits, however. It does not cover slander or libel or creating a danger for the country or individuals. So, for example, you cannot start saying or printing untrue things about people to damage their reputation or business and not have any consequences. Someone can sue you for that. Now, you can't be put in jail for that. That is slander if it's spoken, or libel if it's printed. But you can be sued and you may have to pay damages for that. Now, creating a danger for the country or individuals, you can't openly advocate to kill people or seriously or to overthrow the government of the United States. This is where that you have the freedom of speech, but you also can't shout fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire because people will actually get hurt trying to get out. Now, the Second Amendment. This amendment was intended to prevent the national government from taking weapons away from the colonial militia. It is meant to preserve the right of revolution for the people. And of course, remembering the battles of Lexington and Concord, which were originally fought when the British soldiers were moving to take weapons away from the colonists, you can understand how this amendment came into being. This does not stop Congress from regulating the interstate sale of weapons, among other things, however. Now, the Third Amendment prevents the government from forcing people to house soldiers in their homes. Now, this might seem kind of random to you, but if you go back to the Revolution, you remember that that is exactly what the British government was forcing people to do in their homes at one point, quartering soldiers in their homes. And so this was meant to, of course, stop that. Now, the Fourth Amendment requires authorities to have a specific reason to search a premises or seize evidence or people. And these searches or arrests must be based on probable cause and usually require a search warrant if it's a search. This is, again, to prevent government abuse of power. Some of these had happened actually during the colonial times. So you're seeing a definite relation to problems of the colonial times and the amendments to the Constitution here designed to prevent those from happening again. Now, in the Fifth Amendment, no one can be tried for a serious crime unless a grand jury has decided there is enough evidence for a trial. Now, a grand jury is not your small trial jury that decides guilty or not guilty. This is a group of up to 32 people who just cover evidence that's presented to them. And yes, this is something you could end up being called into for jury duty. And you would then decide, is there enough evidence to bring this guy to trial and possibly convict him? And if you don't think so, then it's thrown out. The indictments would be thrown out. A person found innocent of a crime also may not be tried again for the same crime. Now, this doesn't cover appeals, but the idea is, let's say you were found guilty, you were tried for being a bank robber, and you were found guilty, and then you were sentenced to 5 years in prison. And then after you got out, 5 years later, you were tried again for the crime that you had literally just got out of prison for, and then sentenced to prison again for another 5 years. Well, they can't do that. That's called double jeopardy. You cannot be tried again for the same crime. No one may be forced to testify against themselves. This is where you've seen in all those movies or TV shows someone taking the fifth. And what that means is you cannot force somebody to testify or provide incriminating testimony against themselves. This is designed to stop, obviously, abuse of power by government officials. The government may not deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law, meaning that if you're going to get put in jail, if they're going to fine you, then you have a right to have that actually done in a court. That a court has to decide that, and it has to follow certain rules and procedures. Again, designed to stop the government from violating your rights. The government does have the power to take private property for public use, and this power is called eminent domain. So, for example, if the government felt that that a farm was in the way of a brand new project that was going to help out an entire community or the entire state or the entire country, the government could force that farmer to sell his farm now and then take the land and use it for that public purpose. They do have to provide money to whoever is giving up the property, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the person giving up the property is happy about it. Now, the Sixth Amendment gives people accused of a crime important rights. First, the government must hold a speedy trial by an impartial jury. And a person can ask for a judge to decide their case instead of a jury, or for a change of venue. Now, a change of venue means that if you don't think you're going to get a fair trial where the trial is currently being held. Let's say people in the community don't like you and you think that they're going to be biased against you no matter what the evidence is. You can ask for a change of venue saying, I don't think I'm going to get a fair trial here, and I would like the trial to be held in another community nearby where people don't know me. That was the purpose of that. And of course, a speedy trial is so they're like, oh yeah, we're going to arrest you and we'll get you to trial soon. Maybe in another 25 years we'll see about holding that trial, but you can stay in this prison cell. No, that's not allowed. Now, any accused person also has the right to know the charges against them and to question all witnesses against them. So if they arrest you and they charge you with a crime, they have to tell you what that crime is. Obviously, you can't really defend yourself if you don't even know what they're trying to say you're guilty of. And if someone says you did something, you have the right to basically cross-examine them, as you see in the movies. You have a right to question those witnesses so that you can draw out whether or not they actually know what they're talking about. And an accused person also has the right to be defended by a lawyer, which is, of course, why you have a lawyer that is provided to you free of charge at the public expense, the public defender, if you can't afford one on your own, or if you just want to. The Seventh Amendment provides that the right for a jury trial in federal courts to settle all disputes about property that's worth more than $20. $20 used to be worth a lot more than it is today, but you have the right for a jury trial for that. Now, if both parties agree, they can have a judge decide the case instead of a jury. And the Eighth Amendment prohibits excessive bail and fines. So let's say somebody said that, hey, you're loitering, which means you're hanging around and there's a law against it. We're going to sentence you to 25 years in prison and $1 million fine. Well, the Eighth Amendment prohibits that. They said the punishment really has to fit the crime. Now, a person can also not be imprisoned to work off a fine. Like, oh, we're just, you owe $1 million, so we're going to put you in prison until you work off that fine. No, a fine is different. This amendment bans cruel and unusual punishments, basically. Now, the Ninth Amendment says rights not mentioned by the Constitution are still kept by the people. Remember I had said before in class about a right to privacy. You'll not find a right to privacy in the Constitution itself. But the Ninth Amendment says just because we don't list these rights doesn't mean you don't have them. You still have these rights. The 10th Amendment says powers that are not given to the national government by the Constitution belong to the states or to the people. And this is where the basis of the states' rights movement or state sovereignty is. The idea is that the national government's power was supposed to be limited to just what was specifically listed in the Constitution. And so individuals who are constantly fighting for a smaller government point to this amendment and say that their interpretation of the Constitution is more correct. Now, in the 11th Amendment, a state cannot be sued by citizens of another state or a foreign country in federal court. The 12th Amendment states that separate ballots are used in the Electoral College to determine the president and vice president. This goes back to the election of 1800, where Thomas Jefferson, who was the presidential candidate for the Democratic Republicans, and Aaron Burr, who was the vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Republicans, kept getting tie votes in the Electoral College. So they had to go to the House of Representatives to decide who was going to become president, even though they're both members of the same party, and it was obvious that Jefferson was meant to be president. So they changed the system so that separate ballots are used for the president and vice president. Civil War amendments, pretty obvious. The 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. The 14th Amendment protects the rights of citizenship from the states, because the fear was that the states would say that the former slaves could not be citizens, and therefore would be able to deprive the rights of African Americans in that way. But the 14th Amendment says no, the national government decides who the citizens are. And the 15th Amendment prevents the states from taking away the right to vote on the basis of race. Problem solved, right? No. That's where, when the Jim Crow laws came into effect, and poll taxes came into effect, and literacy tests came into effect, what they did was they found ways to prevent the right to vote for African Americans, but they technically didn't do it on the basis of race. They did it on the basis of something else, but it was just built in such a way to prevent that one group from being able to vote, which is why laws would need to change. Later in the civil rights movement had to happen. Later amendments. 16th Amendment gave Congress the power to levy individual income taxes. That's right, they needed an amendment to the Constitution to be able to tax incomes. Before that, almost the entire federal government ran under tariffs, taxes on imports from foreign countries. The 17th Amendment gives the people, not the state legislatures, the power to elect U.S. senators. Under the original Constitution, the people's house was the House of Representatives. The people voted on them. But the states chose who was going to the Senate, so the state legislatures. So there would be a majority of the citizens and there'd be a majority of the states. Well, to make the system more democratic, the 17th Amendment said the people would vote for their own state senators and the state legislatures would not anymore. The 18th Amendment brought prohibition, no more drinking. That's the one that outlawed alcohol. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. The 20th Amendment set new dates for Congress and the President to begin their terms. They didn't used to begin until March, but the new dates now begin them in January. And I believe that the reason for this was with modern transportation systems, people were able to travel faster, and this ended up shortening the time where a person would have lost an election but was still president or Congress member to push laws through. We saw how that happened with the midnight appointments all the way back in the end of John Adams' presidency. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. So the 21st Amendment ended prohibition. The 22nd Amendment set a 2-term limit on the presidency. This is after FDR's death, and of course he was the only president to be elected to more than 2 terms. He was elected to 4 terms. The 23rd Amendment allowed citizens who lived in Washington, D.C. the ability to vote in presidential elections. Some of you might be asking, how is that possible they weren't allowed to vote for president? Well, in order to vote for president, you had to live in a state, and technically the District of Columbia is not a state. And it was made that way because people were afraid that whoever lived in the capital city would already have too much power. As it is today, you might have noticed that if you're near Washington, D.C., the license plates on Washington, D.C. actually have the motto, taxation without representation, because they don't have any members in Congress who can vote. So their statement is they are being taxed as members of the country, but they don't have any say in Congress. The 24th Amendment prohibits poll taxes in federal elections. The 25th Amendment established presidential succession, basically clearing things up there. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to the age of 18. And the 27th Amendment makes congressional pay raises effective for the term after they are passed. And that one was ratified in 1992. So these are your amendments. And you should know, obviously, the big ones and even some of the small ones, too. And I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Have a good day.